to speaking with you guys. This is a topic that's been at the forefront of my mind, as it is no surprise to you, I'm sure, for the past several months. And speaking with my patients and my students, these topics are an important thing to discuss, and as we'll look at throughout the talk today. They're affecting every aspect of our lives. So food has become an even more important topic than it had been before, from what I'm seeing from my patients. So here's a quick overview of what I plan to discuss today. And as Twin said, I'd like to make this interactive. So as much as possible, if when you have questions or you want to make a comment, please feel free to pop those into the chat box. So here's the overview of where we're going today. And during this quarantine, this is something that we're all experiencing. We are now responsible for feeding ourselves in a way that most of us haven't been in our lives. We can't go out to eat. We can't stop in at the corner stores frequently. So we're both feeding ourselves as well as our families predominantly, that's the majority of the place we're getting our food. And food can also be a tempting source of relief and a place to find comfort or maybe entertainment. So it's also a powerful tool that we can use to stay healthy, both in terms of our mental health as well as immune function. We're additionally experiencing lots of disrupted schedules. Things that we used to take for granted in terms of having specific times to eat, meal breaks, dinner times, those kinds of things aren't always happening. And this can cause some disruption in terms of what we're eating and when. So today I'm going to discuss how stress impacts eating and offer you some practical tips on how to manage meal preparation, grocery shopping, and coping with some of the common stressors that I'm seeing in terms of the sort of quarantine diet with my patients and my students. Topics like excessive snacking, turning to frequent desserts, and comfort foods. Okay, so not just now, but at any time in our lives, the key to maintaining a healthy diet is really about planning. But especially in times when we have fewer external drivers of our schedule. So it's a good idea to start thinking about how we can replace these, maybe replicate the routines and schedules that we normally had in our lives. And a sure way to make unhealthy choices is to end up in a point of excess hunger. So I'm going to talk about hunger and fullness and managing when we eat and how long we take in between meals as a key piece here. And many of you, I'm sure, have experienced grocery shopping on an empty stomach, how differently your grocery cart looks in those times versus when you're well fed. And research on this topic is pretty clear. It shows that people who eat when they're hungry and stop when they're full, pretty simple concepts, but not things that most of us do, tend to eat less food, enjoy their food more, think about food less, and are better able to manage their health and their weight. When I'm talking about planning, I don't mean this to sound overly prescriptive. We don't have to be incredibly specific about things, but having a general plan or outline maybe for how you eat, when you're going to eat, what kinds of foods you might be eating will really help. And that's the key point here. Making decisions at the time of a meal when you're hungry will mean you lean on convenience foods. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and how to work with our brain physiologies around that. Okay, so first I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise. So take a moment right now to rate your hunger. And we're using a scale from 1 to 10. And if you're comfortable, you can use the chat box to let me know what you think, or let the group know. Pick a number from 1 to 10, tuning into your own signals. How hungry are you right now? 1 being not at all, 10 being the most full. And now describe how you came up with that number. What sort of signals maybe that you used to determine that? And again, if you're comfortable, go ahead and type something into the chat box. I see we have some answers coming in already. Lots of low numbers. Good. Many of you are not hungry. It's good. Maybe you can stay focused because you're not too hungry. Okay. And so it looks like many of you are typing in that, obviously it's 2 o'clock. So this might be close to a meal that you've just had lunch. So you're using that, maybe you're using that knowledge. We call this external information, right? Oh, I just ate, so I must not be hungry. But you also might notice a sense of a physical sensation, like a sense of fullness from the meal. And if I asked you to describe what fullness feels like, how would you answer that question? Again, feel free to type that into the box and we'll see what people say. Someone says bloated. There was one comment, not distracted by an empty feeling in the stomach. So the hunger and fullness are different signals, but they're connected, of course. And sometimes we can say, oh, I'm not hungry because I'm full, or I'm not full because I'm hungry. But of course, I use this scale 1 to 10. It's not, a black and white or a binary thing. There's a range in there. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because generally people aren't that connected to what these feelings are. And by becoming more in tune with the body's signals, you can start to make choices around how much to eat and when to eat that are more aligned with what your body really needs. Most people, or many people, are really only aware of these sensations at the extremes. We don't feel hungry until we're starving or it's an emergency. We don't feel full until we feel stuffed and we've overeaten. But there's a middle ground in there that you can start. What's going on in front of us at the moment, which is when you're eating a meal, the sensations of eating. Oh, I'm getting a notice that my internet connection is not stable. Hopefully, let me know if I start to break up or anything. Hopefully that doesn't become a problem. Okay, so as I was saying, you can increase your enjoyment of food by paying more attention. And when you do that, you can also eat less food and have just as much enjoyment as you did when you ate more food. One way to bring this into your daily life or into your own practice can be to ask yourself a question: why am I eating? And this question is not about bringing some judgment against yourself for, oh, why am I eating? Why are you eating again? Something like that. It's more of an inquisitive mind. Just be aware. Oh, I'm eating right now because I'm hungry, or I'm eating right now because I'm bored, or because those cookies look good. And there's lots of reasons that we eat. It could be for stress management. It could be for entertainment. It could be because we need to nourish ourselves. So by bringing more understanding and more awareness of this, you can have a little bit more control and potentially eat from your intentions versus eating from things like cravings. Okay, So we also know from studies that what is in a person's environment greatly determines their food intake. So if you step back and think about this, sometimes this is driven by habit. So a habit that I see a lot now that's happening is around dessert. Some of my patients used to eat dessert maybe once a week. It was like sort of a treat on the weekend. And now I'm seeing that they're eating dessert pretty much every night. This starts to become a habit, and the brain starts to expect this sweet taste, this experience after a meal, to the point where the meal is not complete or the evening is not complete without it. So we can quickly develop these, and these are chemical habits that get laid down neurologically in the brain and the body that can be difficult to break, but just like we formed them, we can unform them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So these habits can be driven by, or sorry, these behaviors around food can be driven by habits and psychology. Thinking about how the brain works, one overly simplistic, but I think useful way to think about it is we have this old brain and new brain. And the old brain is also known kind of like the reptilian brain. And this brain makes decisions and creates thoughts and drives behavior based on our most basic needs. So we need enough calories and we want some pleasure, those kinds of things. And the new brain is the more and then that old brain starts to kick in and you get more cravings, and some people say it feels like they have less willpower. That's another way to talk about it. So if you don't want to make decisions from your old brain, make sure that you aren't too tired or too hungry before you decide what you're going to eat. So this is where planning really comes into play. The last thing I'll say about this is that the brain is also very influenced by the other senses that it takes in. And in terms of food, that mostly has to do with sight and smell. Sight being a really important one here. So if you think about your kitchen and think about what's on the counter of your kitchen. Is there any food on the counter? Any food that is visible? So maybe you have a bowl of cookies that you've made that you can see. And if you walk past those cookies on your way to the other room, you do that 3 or 4 times, generally most people eventually will have a cookie, whether they're hungry or it's a snack time or not. They're cued by that visible signal of something enjoyable. So conversely, if you have something like fruit out on the counter, you're less likely to eat that out of a point of weakness versus a point of intention. So one quick tip you can use is to make sure you always cover and put away snack foods or sweets, things like that. Try that yourself and see if that changes how often you eat those foods or are tempted by those foods. So let's look at how to keep the mind and the body well fed. So I mentioned that if you are overly hungry, then you're going to be making decisions from the old brain. So in the opposite side of that, if you're well fed, well nourished, then you're less likely to be relying on that decision-making process. So a couple basics about nourishment over the next few slides. This really is about getting the nutrients that we need without overburdening our digestive and metabolic systems with excess unhealthy foods. So this is, of course, about what you are eating and also about what you aren't eating. and additionally about when and how much, right? So the timing and the quantity matters as much as the type of foods. I had a patient I was talking to the other day who was saying she wished her refrigerator could talk to her. And if it could, she said, it would likely say, "You again?" Because, of course, she's been returning there frequently during the day. And you can start to look into why that behavior is happening in terms of, fatigue, like we talked about, or hunger, or it could also be stress, anxiety, those kinds of things can drive that. So that's a little bit about the when. Now, additionally, we want to recognize that food is only going to keep you full for so long and keep you energized for a limited amount of time. So this is why it's important to avoid long stretches between meals. Or if you do, to have a healthy snack that you've planned ahead of time in order to keep your energy levels high enough so that you don't crash and need to use that old brain to make decisions. This point is a good one to bring up the individualized nature of nutrition. Some of my patients do really well with this kind of like eat 6 times a day concept, 3 meals, 3 snacks. Others don't, and they find that eating 2 or 3 times a day works just fine for them. There's no one size fits all with this kind of thing. What really matters is for you to pay attention, as we've been talking about, and experiment, especially right now when schedules are different and the eating patterns and habits have changed so much. So this third point on the slide gets a little bit more into the what of nourishment, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then the last one, of course, is about quantity, and thinking back to that idea of not recognizing our fullness until we're stuffed. That feeling is as it feels, as we recognize when we're in that state, it's putting pressure onto the body's systems, to our digestive system and our metabolic system. And eventually, when we do that over a lifetime, over decades, it wears out our body's systems, our organ systems, can lead to chronic diseases. So that's the sort of long-term effect of it, but there's also a short-term effect that we all experience. If you eat to the point of overfull, what happens next? It's often fatigue. We get that like couch potato sort of feeling. So you can see the pretty immediate impact that eating a large quantity of food can have, in this case, on the brain. So thinking about this idea of providing the right nutrients and not overburdening the body's systems, you can use something like this, which is the healthy eating plate, as a guide, a simple way to look at the food in front of you and see if it's generally healthy for you. There's a couple reasons why I like this particular plate. There's different plates designed by many different health organizations. This one is done, as you can see, by the Harvard School of Public Health. And as a good resource for you guys, you can go to Nutrition Source, their nutrition website. It's got a plethora of information, articles about latest research, but also some basics about nutrition that I find really helpful. And looking at this is a way to think about the proportions of what you eat. So how you compose your plate has a huge impact on the kinds of nutrients you're getting, how quickly you digest your food, how long you will stay full, and the health impact both on your body system and your mind. I think a good example that you can think about this with is spaghetti and meatballs, right? So comfort food for many people. Noodles would be the grain. In this case, if it's a whole grain pasta, it's whole grains. And the meatballs, of course, would be the protein. Generally, you serve that plate of food and it's 75% grain, 25% protein. No vegetables, maybe a little in the tomato sauce. That's arguable. And then in order to create that meal into a healthy plate, you would obviously need to increase the vegetables quite a bit. And often when talking about this healthy plate, I will just take the fruits off during the dinner, as we're talking about, and have that half plate be vegetables. So instead of that pasta with meatballs, you would have pasta, meatballs, and broccoli. Maybe you saute or roast the broccoli, mix it in with the sauce. You use half as much pasta. And then you have a plate of food that's the same size, but now it's nutrient dense, it's got some color, it's got fiber, and you're going to have much less calories in that plate as well. Okay, so from this healthy plate concept, we can expand next into creating a healthy meal plan. So this is important, of course, for our current situation, in part because it's going to allow you to be a little less reliant on frequent grocery trips, be a little bit more able to feed yourself without needing to get takeout or food delivery, and it can help you with your food budget. And this can be a challenging thing to take on for those of us who aren't regular cooks, who don't generally do this kind of meal planning. But by following a few simple tips, you can start to establish routines that don't take too much time and will help to stretch the grocery trips as well as your food budget out. So I've broken these down into these four basic categories. And we're going to step through constructing healthy meals and meal planning together through this process. So this first one, this is where you're letting the healthy plate be your guide. And what you can think about here is vegetable forward meals, sometimes it's called. If you're familiar with the writer Michael Pollan, his quote for healthy eating: eat food, mostly plants, not too much. So that kind of encompasses the healthy plate as well. So that's number one. Number two, thinking about the base. So the example I gave a few minutes ago with the pasta dish, that pasta is the base of the meal. How much of it are you eating, and what is it that you're having, so that you're not just reliant on pasta, potatoes, and white rice. And I'll go through a couple of ideas around that in a few minutes. So the third one about staying in budget, again, choosing foods that will last you a little bit longer. And then lastly, we don't want to forget about snacking. Again, planning for healthy eating includes meals and snacks. Okay, so I'm going to use those four planning concepts to go through the different components of the healthy plate, sort of one by one. So we'll start with what every dietitian will tell you is the most important part: vegetables. So here it's important to choose a combination of vegetables. So you want dark green leafy vegetables. Those are some of the most nutrient dense foods that you can eat. So, we're thinking about kale and chard and spinach, these kinds of foods. However, as you've probably experienced, these foods don't tend to last that long. So you won't be able to keep the vegetables on your plate throughout the week, or maybe 2 weeks if you want to wait that long, if all you have are those foods. So instead, you want to make sure that you get some. These are more watery vegetables, and then the less watery ones are the harder vegetables, often root vegetables that will last a little bit longer. Sometimes they're called storage vegetables. So this is in part why you may have seen a lot of people talking about cooking a lot with cabbage. So you can buy a head of cabbage, keep it in the fridge, and it'll last quite a while. Don't be worried about or scared of using frozen vegetables. Freezing usually happens at the point of harvest, and it preserves most of the nutrients in the food quite well until you cook it. So those can be really helpful to have on hand to get you through when maybe you've run out of the fresh vegetables. And you can also make your own frozen vegetables. If you buy a large quantity of vegetables and you want to preserve them, you can go ahead and chop them up and freeze them. They also can be added to large quantities of food, like if you make a big pot of stew, casserole, those kinds of things. You can freeze it once you've cooked that as well, and then have it ready for a meal in minutes. So fruits are going to kind of follow a very similar guideline as the vegetables did. Again, freezing, a good option. Although you might have to be a little more creative with the frozen fruit, because freezing does change the texture. Fruit's a little bit more delicate in general than vegetables are. So here you might think that you can use frozen fruit as a food to add to other things, like hot cereals, oatmeal, for example, or maybe muffins that you might be making. You can also make some kind of simple frozen dessert, like a fruit-based popsicle or sorbet. And also thinking of, similar to veggies, thinking of buying fruits in combination, some that won't last quite as long, like strawberries, which are in season right now, along with some of the harder fruits that have a little bit more shelf life. Things like apples, pears, the harder fruits, as well as with the peels like oranges, citrus, and those kinds of things. So for freezing fruit, a good technique for that is to chop up the fruit into bite-sized pieces, and then spread it out on a baking sheet or something like that, even a plate. Freeze it like that. Once they're frozen, take it out and then put them in a airtight Ziploc bag or some kind of non-glass storage container, and then freeze them that way. Okay, so our third area of the plate that we're going to talk about is the starch or the grain. So this is, again, the kind of bulk of your meal. And it's really important, especially in these times, to have foods that in the cupboard that you can turn to that are easy to prepare, inexpensive, filling, and long-lasting. And often those are going to be this category. So, as we were talking about with pasta, not an unhealthy food, but you don't want to over-rely on refined and processed grains for every meal. By doing that, you're going to be missing out in valuable nutrients. And you might be getting excess calories, as we talked about with the proportion of the plate. So some key concepts here. Beans and legumes are some of the healthiest foods that we have. They're high in fiber, protein, complex carbohydrates. They help manage, control blood sugar. They're good for digestion. And they're filling, nutrient-dense foods. They also last a long time, and they're relatively inexpensive. With grains, the healthiest way to eat a grain is when you can actually see it. So think brown rice, quinoa. The grain is visible. Less healthy is when the grain has been broken down into a flour and concentrated, obviously, then creating something like pasta, bread, tortillas. So the issue with these foods is not that they're unhealthy, it's just that they're very concentrated and it's really easy to eat more than we need. And don't fear the starchy vegetables. So I often hear people saying, "Oh, I don't eat potatoes because they're too many carbs," or "I don't eat sweet potato because they're too many carbs," or "I don't eat cauliflower because it's white." You know, these are plant foods. These are healthy foods, and they're very versatile in the kitchen. If you think about something like cauliflower, you've probably seen cauliflower rice and cauliflower pizza crust, these kinds of things. You can do these at home as well. It's really not that hard. And I'm going to show you a good resource for finding recipes as well as cooking tips. When you do choose foods that are made from flour, and I'm not suggesting you shouldn't, you just need to watch the amount that you're eating. Ideally, you're choosing a whole grain version, so this would be the whole grain bread. But even if you don't, a slice of bread is not a problem as long as it fits into that healthy plate that we were talking about. Okay, so the last section of our exploration of the healthy plate is about protein. And this is one that the majority of Americans eat more than they need and generally spend the most money on in terms of food. So on the slide, I've listed a couple of less expensive, longer lasting options that might be helpful for you during the quarantine. You can follow a few simple guidelines as well to help you manage your protein intake and not break your food budget. One of them is to use meat sparingly. Remember that only a quarter of your plate needs to be protein. So generally this works out to about 4 ounces, and that's about the size of your palm, same thickness. Some of you might be thinking, ooh, that's not enough. It's very easy, and many people do get used to large portions of protein, especially for dinner. But I'd like to, challenge yourself. There's nothing that says biologically you have to have that much. It mostly is a psychological thing where we've, again, gotten into the habit or gotten used to eating a certain amount of food. Another way to eat protein at this time can be to use those beans that I was talking about, the plant-based proteins. This will both add variety to your diet as well as boost the nutrient content, as I was discussing, of your meals. If that's a bit too far for you, you can also think of combining the two. So I think a good example here is one of a pot of chili. You can either make chili with ground beef and then all the tomatoes and the spices and things like that, or you can make it with just beans, or you can make it with a combination of the two. Doing that, you can use less meat and still get some of that same kind of flavor experience and texture that you would have before, but you've cut down the meat consumption, reducing the cost and increasing the nutrients. And then lastly, for some longer lasting proteins that you can keep in the fridge, of course, the dried beans, things like nuts and nut butters, but also canned fish like canned tuna, canned or pouches of chicken. And with things like that, you do want to check the label on the back of the food just to make sure it's not packed with excessive sodium, salt, or fat. Sometimes they oil pack tuna. You just look for the one that's water packed. Okay, so here's where we're going to talk a little bit about some recipe ideas. And in this final section of the talk, it's really about putting it all together. So thinking about the composition of a meal, maybe getting some inspiration to cook some different things. And I'll leave you with this resource, of course. So I'm going to point out, once I go into the website, the recipe search function, which is really robust, and you can use it to find all sorts of things, as well as they have links for learning how to cook. So this is the website that I'm talking about, and this is from an organization, it's a nonprofit called Feeding America, and one of their goals is to help people eat healthfully on a budget. So it's a really valuable resource for most of us right now. And I'm in their recipe section here. And as you can see on the side, this is their recipe filter. And one of the things that I really like is the ingredient section. So let's see, I'm going to go down to, we were talking about cabbage. So let me find that one. So you select on cabbage and you can see the different variety of recipes here. You know, there's things that are cooked, there's things that are raw. They're all very colorful, lots of flavors. You've got soups, salads, stir fries, and that's just the first page. So in addition, let me go back to the main screen that they had for their recipes. As you look through this, you'll notice that they have a lot of foods on here with beans. Here's a chili, for example, lentil soup. But just point out that over here we have the filter recipes. And again, I'll just click on the cabbage. So you can see, I mean, it's a beautiful website. They do a really nice job. And each one of these, if you click through it, you're going to get the recipe as well as I said, the videos for how to cook some of these foods. It's a nice sort of skills-based learning that you can do. And then moving back to this main screen, again, seeing the different variety of foods here that are, these are essentially plant-based. They do have meat on the website, but currently there isn't anything on this front page. And I think they've done that on purpose because meat is, as we're seeing, becoming a little bit more expensive, maybe even a bigger problem in the future. It's unclear how the food system is going to handle that, right? So hopefully you can all see the slides again. Well, thanks again. It was a privilege to be able to talk with you today and share some of my experience and the experience I've been having with some of my patients and students. So I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and you know, feel free to get in touch. You can contact myself or Twin. You can find our information on the CHRC website.